evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Melissa Lampy, and I am proud to be the president of the Watertown Historical Society. This is our final public history meeting of the year, so we're very excited that you all came out to join us. Just a little bit of wrap up for the Octagon House this year. Of course, our season ended on October 31st. For those of you who were here at our April meeting, I did share that we have some concerns up there with longevity and keeping things going, and those concerns still exist. For next year, please encourage all of your friends and neighbors to visit us at the Octagon House. Remember us in your wills. Donations are always accepted. The house is very expensive to maintain, and costs continue to escalate year after year. But tonight we are here to talk about Watertown history and Christmas, which are two wonderful things to pair together. Randy Roeseler, who is a longtime friend of the Historical Society, will be our speaker this evening. And he's going to talk about the movie It's a Wonderful Life and compare it to vintage scenes of Watertown that correlate to the movie. And the inspiration for this talk is from a bank advertising piece that Randy has that's from 1947. Yes. So without further ado, we'll turn it over to Randy. Thank you.
Well, early happy holidays to you. I received a real shock yesterday and today. I finally realized next week is Thanksgiving. I kept kind of thinking there was like another week or so coming. And we've been so spoiled with the weather this year. Until the other night I had geraniums blooming. Now they're not blooming. But to get into mid-November and still have flowers is really a treat for Wisconsin. Well, it's a pleasure to join you for a season wrap-up. I am going to speak, as Melissa said, on the movie It's a Wonderful Life and how it related to Watertown and actually many small to medium-sized cities in the nation. That movie has a fun history to it. I think we'll share a little humor as we walk through the evening and hopefully come away ready for the holiday season with a little pep in our step, so to speak. The film It's a Wonderful Life was released in December of 1946, formally released with promotion in January of 1947. It was not originally released as a Christmas movie the way we think about it today. That came about with the passage of time. But there were elements there that kind of planted the seed. You know, the family goes through a crisis, and actually in the movie the crisis happens right before Christmas. But overall the movie shows many scenes from throughout the year. And of course we can't forget the banker Old Man Potter, who was to the movie a kind of a Scrooge type character. And we'll hear more about him a little later. Frank Capra, and I'm going to just quote or paraphrase from some research that I did. Frank Capra was the movie's director. Frank had an extensive career in Hollywood with movies back in the golden era of movies. He lived long enough into his retirement and his old age to see the movie come back again after years and years of resting quietly in movie vaults in Hollywood, or maybe just shown here and there on late night TV. In 1984, he was interviewed about the movie, and this is his quote. When he was asked about the success of it, he said, and I quote, "It's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. The movie now has a life of its own, and I can look at it, but I had nothing to do with it. I'm like a parent whose kid grows up to be president. I'm proud, but the kid did his own work." And then he went on to say that he didn't think of it as a Christmas movie. He had a script and a story that was behind the script and studied it. But he liked it because it talked about people and everyday life and the fact that you should believe in what you're doing and the way you help other people. And he did it in part to combat at that time what he saw was a trend toward atheism. But overall, he enjoyed the movie. Jimmy Stewart claimed later on in life that it was his favorite movie. Donna Reed enjoyed it, and there were many other actors and actresses who had smaller roles in it as well. Several of them went on to have lifelong careers in the acting or motion picture industry. You mind giving it a tap?
Sure thing.
So Bedford Falls is the fictitious city in the movie, and then there's Watertown, and there are other small towns, and it really is a wonderful life. That's the advertising piece, and if you want, after a while, you can look at it. It has become very fragile. It is what they call a die cast, and you can see it's a Christmas tree decorated. The bottom is a honeycomb bell, and it's faded now, but when I got this in the 1980s, it was still fairly red. So when you fold that out, it gave a nice 3-dimension to it. On the back side, as you can see, it says, "Join the Christmas Club." Farmers and Citizens Bank of Watertown, the Bank of Watertown, Merchants National Bank of Watertown, and the Wisconsin National Bank. A class for every purse and a club for every purpose. Does that bring tears to your eyes or what? As a former teller and teller supervisor, I will tell you otherwise. So this was designed to be a decoration. You could hang it on a tree. You could have hung it in a doorway with some greens. You could have had it perhaps in an indoor wreath. There were things you could do with it, and it was meant to be used. I'm guessing they probably had maybe 500 of these printed at most. City was much smaller back then. Gave them away for a limited time period. Each bank would have had about 100, 125. I don't know how many, do any of you have this piece? So, there's only a few that exist. First thing, when I bought this, I got this back in the 1980s when I first started collecting. I was in my mid-20s. And I don't remember where I got it. It was either from a rummage sale or an auction or an estate sale, one of my 3 favorite haunts. I can tell you that I made very little money at that time, so I didn't pay a fortune for it. eBay didn't exist, so it was a local purchase. I had to study at that time through city directories and talking to people where these banks were. The Farmers and Citizens Bank was at the corner of 3rd and Main Street in what is today the empty bookstore building. That bank merged into the M&I Bank, or the Bank of Watertown, in the 1950s. That was our first real bank merger. Everybody, when you talk about bank mergers, everyone thinks, oh, that happened in the 1980s. We were way ahead of the trend. That little bank was merged into M&I Bank, or Bank of Watertown. At the time of this, Bank of Watertown was at the corner of 1st and Main Street. I can't think of what's in it today.
There's a boutique.
It's a boutique.
Right.
Merchants National Bank at that time was also at 1st and Main Street. That's the building that today is Clara's Antique Shop.
Across the street.
Yep. And just across the bridge, another block away, was the Wisconsin National Bank, which that site today is Partnership Bank, but Wisconsin National Bank became Security Bank and then was merged into M&I, which is now part of BMO, or the Bank of Watertown. So that was the bank history.
Valley Bank Associated?
Yep, that's right, Valley Bank was in there in one step. So when I got this, I liked it. I had it hanging from fish wire, because fish wire is, the plastic stuff is almost invisible. And I had it hanging from this piece of curling ribbon over the corner of my desk. And you could see it, and people would admire it, but it was safe. So now I have to tell you about Paul Kerr. Paul Kerr was an active man in business in Watertown. He ran the savings and loan. We weren't like Bailey Brothers Building and Loan anymore, but he ran the savings and loan. At the time I bought this in the mid-1980s, Paul was already retired from the savings and loan. We had endured our first merger. Paul still came home for monthly board meetings. And Paul had a small corner office that he used that we had vacated. His formal office was now used by other people for managing. Well, one thing Paul retained was a liquor cabinet, which we don't have in banks anymore. And when Paul came home for his monthly board meeting, there were usually 1 or 2 nights where he'd stay and work on a few things. And some of us would work, till 5:30, maybe cleaning up loose ends. And it wasn't uncommon for Paul to show up with his small tray, and I would get my brandy old fashioned, and he and Bob would have a Manhattan, and Dave had a glass of wine, and Paul knew our order. He came walking in my office one night, put the tray down, and said, "Where on earth did you get this?" So I told him what I could about it, And I said I kind of like picking up some banking pieces from the city's old history. And he said, Randy, I can tell you all about that bell, or this Christmas tree. He said, this came out in Christmas of '47, after the war. And he said, prior to the war, in the late 1930s, the banks had gotten together and decided they were done with Christmas clubs because they were so pokey and so much work. I got news for you people. Christmas clubs back then were a pain in the back end. They were in my era in the 70s and 80s as well. You took those deposits in every week, and those books had to be marked. Then in November, we mailed out a check, and of course all the checks had to be added and proved. And then a day later, they'd all bring their checks back and cash them for Christmas and put some in their savings, and then they'd open a new Christmas account. And you did that paperwork, and they got their free gift, which I now see in antique shops and on eBay. And then it would start all over again. The latter years, they were automated, and I don't know what people do anymore because we don't have Christmas clubs. But anyway, they decided enough. Way back in the 1930s, early 1940. Well, if you remember in the movie, It's a Wonderful Life, Mr. Potter's greatest nemesis was that darn building and loan because it just kept on going and kept on going. And that was the same way all across America. And the savings and loan never stopped doing Christmas clubs. And after the war, when the men came back, and the ladies as well who served, they had attitudes about life. They had been through a great tribulation, and they had learned a lot about themselves, and they were going to do things differently and move on. And they started using the GI Bill and the VA program to buy homes. And the savings and loan was doing VA loans, and the banks decided they better do VA loans. And the 4 Watertown banks did this to get the Christmas club business back, because they had started to lose small savers who became constant savers who saved money and bought homes and used those special bills. And so that's what this was all about. It was a way to get business back. And it's probably one of the few times that all the banks in Watertown, or for that business, any other community, went together on one advertising promo, because it doesn't, the banks are listed in alphabetical order. It doesn't list any one bank with priority by size or anything else. So that was the story of the bell. And then he said to me, have you ever seen the movie It's a Wonderful Life? And at that point, I had seen it once because of a friend who had a video, or rented a video that was just coming out at that time. And I said, yes, I had seen it. And he said, when I came to work at the Savings and Loan in the 1940s, that's what Watertown was like. That's what every small town was like. Many of the savings and loans were on a second floor or rented space. They were still getting going. By that time of that movie, Watertown Savings and Loan actually owned its own small building on 3rd Street. It had been prosperous despite the Great Depression. But he said, things that they captured in the movie, and the houses and the way people acted, every city was like that. And as you study writing about the movie or people's remembrances, that is the truth. And what actually happened is that the movie captured everyday life throughout America at the cusp of change. Because right after the movie came out and people settled into the post-war environment, things did change. And mannerisms changed, work changed, how they did their work, how they were entertained, how they kept their houses, business buildings, everything changed. Not necessarily for the worst, but that change came. So it was very interesting as I look back now on this thing, this bell, to remember things he told me about the community and how that movie touched so many people because of what it captured. But the movie, and as we walk through these photos, I'll tell you as well, the movie captured everything, the good and the bad. And that's part of why it slept for a while, because as the angel Clarence walked George through his life and showed him how he had touched people's lives, the movie also touched on different things that happened in our nation's history. And people didn't always want to remember the Depression and the wars so much. It was too fresh. They needed to settle and heal. And that was all part of the evolution of this movie and its history. These are some stills from the movie. On the top left, you can see Uncle Billy in the center and 2 of the other clerks looking out of the second-story window at the city below, or the goings-on Main Street. There's a drawing of the building that it was in. You can see the upstairs is marked the building, Bailey Brothers Building and Loan. The first floor is a different type of retail. And then it has a staircase built in. It's an exposed staircase, but it's covered, that you use to get to the second floor. After the Second World War in the early 1950s, in Watertown and many other communities, the second floors of buildings fell into disuse. People were used to spreading out and mall concepts, and they didn't want to climb steps as readily. And for people who couldn't climb steps, that was another topic. It was hard for them to transact if they couldn't get up those steps. In Watertown, the savings and loan, or building and loan, began on the second floor of what is part of the Brown Shoe Company today. When the movie was released, it was rushed a little bit in December of '46. Part of that was in movie politics. They were trying to get it released and work on Academy Award nominations. The big push actually came in January of '47. No matter what they did, the movie was modestly successful with people. It was panned by critics, and it lost money for RKO, which was one of the movie producers at the time. It was filmed on leftovers of a movie set from the 1930s. In 2014, the swimming pool from the dance scene when Jimmy Stewart and Donna Reed were dating and they were doing the Charleston. You remember somebody pushed the button and the floor opened? That pool was still in use in that school building. That building had been repurposed, but the pool was still being used. And you remember Martini's, that was the family that owned the little bar. And they, in the movie, Jimmy Stewart and his wife took a little gift to them as they moved into their first home that they owned, and it was in a small subdivision. That home is still privately owned. That movie was filmed on site in a real subdivision that was being built just after the war. The movie, as I said, slept for a while, but in the 1970s, there were still a lot of locally owned TV stations throughout America, and at late night, they needed to fill airspace, and so they'd rent older movies, and they could do that for a pretty good price. And It's a Wonderful Life is one of the movies that they started to show. And over time, people would call into the stations and ask when they were going to show it. They were planning little gatherings with friends or grandchildren, and so the stations started showing it more often. And then in the 1980s, along came the VCR, and then came the internet, and all the things we can watch 24/7. And the movie came back, and now today has become one of America's favorite Christmas movies. It's estimated that it will remain popular for 75 to 100 years because it'll take that long for generations to pass. In the movie, there's just a couple of stills from the scenes. The lady with the bow on her collar, or on her shoulder, Beulah Bondi. Beulah played mother roles almost all of her life in movies. But her real claim to fame came at the end of her life. She was an actress who, despite being typecast, worked into her old age. And her last role was the recurring role of Martha Corinne Walton on The Waltons. You remember her coming down from the mountains. She was a pretty salty, plain-spoken lady. I apologize, I do not remember this man's name, but one of his most endearing roles was in the movie Mrs. Miniver, where he played Mr. Belden, the station master. And if you remember from that movie, he played, Greer Garson was one of the stars, and he won an award for his beautiful rose. The village had a floral show, and an hour after that village was bombed by the Nazis, and he lost his life in that movie. Very favorite character actor. Above Annie's shoulder, see the lady smiling with a kind of a straw hat? That's Ellen Corby, who became Grandma Walton, and again worked well into her old age and was very successful. And Annie, she was the housekeeper to the Baileys. in that scene where she brings her money to the table to help George out, I always laugh about that line. They were so surprised that she had any money, and she said, "Oh, I've been saving that for a divorce in case I ever got married." Here's the set of Bedford Falls from the movie. I was a little bit taken aback to read that to create that boulevard down the center, they actually cut down and brought in live oak, or what was a live oak tree, but brought in real trees. Some cities had a boulevard at Main Street, ours wasn't quite that wide. And of course, they have the lights strung from one side to the other, which is very magical. Which brings us to one of the photos of Watertown. And I've got a couple of these so you can see how it changed through the years. This is from the archives of Keck Furniture Company, and it's from around 1935. It's a very snowy December in that picture. Note that the garland sweeps up twice for a double swoop. This is 1919. This is from a Christmas card from Beulah Bondi's collection.
That's what you were saying.
Now, I don't know, do any of you remember or did you know the late Clarence Earle? Clarence and Lottie lived on Lavery Street. Clarence was involved with some of the city work of the city. He told me how years ago they would get truckloads of pine scraps, pine boughs, and they would wire that to make the roping for Main Street. And he talked about how sore his hands were. No matter what gloves they wore all scraped and bleeding and whatever. And whatever went on this year, the garland is very skimpy and the wreaths are not quite round. This is a more rare view from the east side of Main Street looking into the downtown. Again, it's the 1927, I believe. The garland is skimpier and the wreaths are somewhat oval, but of course they were still lit, and even in the earliest days that was very magical to people. And when they stood up at the corner of 26th and Church Street by St. Bernard's, it was just like a canopy through the Main Street, and very magical. Lighting was much less advanced, of course, than today, and lighting in general at night was not nearly as bright. This is from 1944 or 46. The garland is nice and lush, and they used a star down the center of the street. A very mild December, there's no snow to be seen. I would have probably been in a panic attack because I like a white Christmas. This is a photo from the photo collection or archives of the late Eleanor Schulz. I included this. This is the Gas and Electric building at the corner of 3rd and Main. Today that's part of the shoe store, Brown Shoes. But at that time, many communities our size had a gas and electric building where you went to pay your bill. But they also had equipment and appliances, the best to be had. But what most people don't remember, and the younger people don't know at all, was that at the time of this photo, 3rd and Main was a major intersection because that's where Highway 26 turned. So at that time, when traffic came in at night and got to that corner and had to turn, that building would have been a full-on view for them. It was pretty by day, and then at night, the star almost has like a crucifix in it.
When was that picture from? That previous one?
That previous one is from the late 40s or early 50s. And it was taken, I don't know if Eleanor's sister Irene took it or a friend of theirs took it. There were some others, they were just little snapshots about so big. And they were taken by an amateur photographer at night, which was quite a feat. You needed to have a tripod and know what you were doing. Beautiful pictures. This is a scene from the movie where George is very frustrated. This is before the angel has appeared to help him find his way. And he's hurling a snowball at the building and loan. He's very frustrated. But in the background, you can see some of the shops. This is a scene of the Stubbe Floral Company in the 400 block at Main Street. This is around 1920, just after the First World War. But really, until the 1950s, many storefronts looked like that. If you watch the Andy Griffith show, when they go shopping, the storefronts are pretty simple, and a lot of them have a look like that. And that's what it was like in Bedford Falls, too. This picture is from 1951, corner of 2nd and Main Street. And we'll see this again a little bit later. Nice crowd of people shopping. Again, a very big lack of snow whenever this was taken. But you can see the garland coming down the poles. And this particular year, they did the double sweep. There's no centerpiece down the street. And there must have been a big sale at Kresge's because there's a huge crowd in that block. But on this picture, what is today the Lions Pub was Penny's for many years. But they have just a simple billboard signage, which they had from 1929 until the late 50s or early 60s when they did a different decor. This is a little hard to see. The next picture is a little clearer. This is a still also from the collections that are online from the movie that shows the house that George and Mary Bailey lived in. And if you remember when George and Mary were dating, they walked by this home and it was very forlorn and derelict. And then they ended up buying it and she restored it room by room, newel post by newel post. That actually made her very, very popular with people because many Americans had bought homes that had to be worked on. And they were thrifty and they saved and did things little by little. And so she endeared herself to a lot of people. On the right, you see their house had a tower with windows. So does the Mahlberger Mansion. We have peekaboo windows up in the attic. So does the Mahlberger Mansion. Big wraparound porch. So does the Mahlberger Mansion. Today, we see the house is missing its porches, but many cities our size had homes like that. It was very typical to people and very familiar. I also, from some records I had at hand, just grabbed a photo of what is Pittman and Kyle, or the law firm. It was the Schmutzler Mansion for many years. Again, that's how it would have looked more or less at the time of the movie. This is a picture of young George Bailey. When George was a kid, he worked as a soda jerk and delivery boy for Old Man Gower, who was the pharmacist. He always did a little routine when he'd go in. But in this movie, when the angel takes him back to his childhood, George at one point rescued his brother. They were out playing with friends, and his brother went through the ice and almost drowned. And in the process of saving his brother, George caught a cold and a very, very bad ear infection. This is from the late 1890s in downtown Watertown, and there were scenes like this throughout the Riverside Park area at Silver Creek. And in every upper Midwestern community that had water, there were kids on the snow and the ice. When George rescued his brother, one of the things that the angel pointed out to him was that if he hadn't rescued his brother, 100 men would have died in a Nazi attack. His brother's actions saved 100 men in World War II. And again, that war thing touches. But also in that same scene from the pharmacy, George notices something is wrong with Mr. Gower. And we can see behind a corner from the viewer's point, Mr. Gower has been drinking. And George notices that Mr. Gower is fouling up a prescription. He recognizes the powders and what is being done as a poison. And in trying to get Mr. Gower's attention, Mr. Gower lashes out at George and cuffs him with his hand, and that ear bleeds. And that, plus the original illness, is why George couldn't serve in World War II, because he was partially deaf on that ear. And Mr. Potter had no end of telling him he wasn't doing his part because he wasn't serving. But Mr. Gower does come to realize he's made a mistake, and he asks George for his forgiveness and hugs him and thanks him for helping him. In the distance, over Mr. Gower's shoulder, the viewer, and at last George, sees the telegram informing Mr. Gower that his son had been killed in France in World War I. And those things were quick, but they were there and they were subtle. And for people watching this movie, they had lived through that war and the Second World War and the Great Depression. All of those things, they're touched on lightly as the angel walks back through George's life, but they resonated clearly with the people who were living through that. This was the original Salick jewelry building at the bridge in downtown Watertown. had an interesting round effect in it, day in. Later on, someone very skillfully filled in the front using some of the same pieces from the original building and the same window tops, but this was bricked in solidly, so that was the 1 hour Martinizing building. Of course, today it's the Riverwalk. So we're not going to restore that building. The top 2 photos show St. John's when it was original in 1908. This photo shows the church being repainted and redecorated in 1948, right after the war. And it was one of the first projects in the city after the war, and let me tell you, for the next 10 to 15 years, the machines were moving and the paintbrushes were swinging throughout Watertown. They had their original artwork completely copied and restored. So the building looked the same from 1908 till 1967. But in this picture, first of all, the OSHA regulations were not invented or as strict. There's a workman up here, and a workman sitting here, and another one over here. And there is no visible sign of support or ropes or anything. They're just up there painting away. But especially when you look at the original photograph, you can see how discolored the walls are. And on the plaster and lath, on the ridges of the lath, you can see the dirt, the coal dust and dirt in the building. Most commercial buildings were either professionally cleaned or redecorated every 20 to 25 years because heating was so dirty years ago. But they had no choice. They had to go all those years because of the money and then the war situation. Downtown, changes came gradually over a period of years. Here was that original photo we shared a few minutes ago. And then this came along, I'm guessing in the 60s, late 50s. A lot of penny stores had that, and it was so thorough they went around the corner to their catalog department and did the same thing. Now today all that's gone. That building has been restored back very much to look like it did in the 1850s. And the corner where it says pennies on top left looks somewhat like that. Fisher's was another building, the original Masonic temple. This was a design to incorporate other buildings and give kind of a unity to it. It was a design from, I'm going to say, the mid-1960s, and then it was painted over the years, and I thought that the paint color actually was a nice improvement. And now a lot of it's been removed, and the Masonic building is pretty much back to the way it looked. This is a snapshot from 1967 of Bergen Brothers. I don't know how long it had looked like that at that point, but what I like about it is the Bergen Brothers building, if you stand from across the street, it's actually a massive brick building that was one of the first brick hotels in Jefferson County. But the building over time was split into 3 real estate parcels. The Bergen Brothers is one, and it still has its original wainscoting in it from the 1800s. And then this is today Del Shimaluski's accounting firm. But this has really an original front entry to it, all the original design. And next to it is this really incredible Lannenstone look, which was very popular in the 50s and 60s. What I consider one of my greatest failures was that when Bergen Brothers closed, I did not go in and beg to buy the clock. Because I have a warped sense of humor. And the clock is here in the front window, and it was always in the front window of the store, and it was a toilet seat. And it had 12 letters around it that said, "Take time to go." And I don't know whatever happened to it, but every time I look at that picture or a couple others, I missed my chance. I really did. I had access to these, and I just threw one or two in. In 1967, 66, 67, Main Street was taken off from top to bottom, widened, new sidewalks, new lighting, new electrical, new everything. It was the year of mud. But in any community, those things have to happen every so often to move forward. You just have to deal with the 5 or 6 months of discomfort and get over it, because we've got to have those improvements to succeed. As I mentioned, it was really the video movement in the 1980s that brought the movie back to people. Suddenly you could rent that movie on a July day if you wanted to. You went down to the video store, which cracks people up now because you just go click, point, download, and watch it. But back then we went to a video store. I can remember way back when my friend Karen and I each chipped in $10 and bought our friend Cindy, who had a VCR, a membership to one of the stores, because then she could name other people up to 2 that could use her account. So guess who the other 2 people were? The gift that kept on giving. But I remember watching that movie a couple times when it was spring or summer. We were just in the mood to see it. And of course today, with the internet, we can access it just about any time. One other fun thing that I wanted to share with you from the movie, in reading through some of the details, that movie was one of the first where they used a chemical concoction to create snow. Prior to that, they used to spray paint or paint cornflakes white. And then they'd have them falling. And they had to redub all the sound for outdoor scenes because as people walked through the snow, crunch, crunch, crunch. I thought that was kind of funny. But it's been a wonderful life for the movie. Mr. Potter, couldn't leave him out of our conversation. Lionel Barrymore was a very accomplished actor, but he outdid himself on this role. In this, one of his quotes, "I'm an old man and most people hate me, but I don't like them either." That sums him up. In 2012 or 2013, the motion picture industry celebrated its centennial. And they did a lot of special features. And a lot of people were interviewed and polled, you know, what's your favorite movie, who was your favorite character, what was your favorite set, what was your favorite song. One of the categories was to list your favorite villain. Now, when you think of some of the movies we've watched, he's still in the top 10. People just dislike Mr. Potter with a passion. And it's really actually it's actually a tribute to his acting. I have to share this with you from May 26th of 1947. This is a statement by the FBI about the movie, because at that time the movie was out about 5 months. They've redacted the name of the officer or official who released this. I'm just going to say Smith. Could have been J. Edgar Hoover for all I know, but we'll just say Smith. With regard to the movie, It's a Wonderful Life, Smith stated in substance that the film represented rather obvious attempts to discredit bankers by casting Lionel Barrymore as a Scrooge type so that he would be the most hated man in the picture. This, according to sources, is a common trick used by communists. In addition, Smith stated that in his opinion, this picture, the movie, deliberately maligned the upper classes, attempting to show that people who had money were mean and despicable characters. So, who'd have thunk it? The movie got a notice even by the FBI. Bell ornaments, do you remember what Clarence taught everybody? Every time a bell rings, an angel gets its wings. And he succeeded by the end of the movie. And the movie did truly capture, as Mr. Kerr said, life in everyday America, just at the cusp of massive changes. Not all the changes were bad, but changes. Merry Christmas 1961 and a happy, wonderful life in 1962 from me and my mom and dad. There's 2 things from that picture I want. I want my hair back, and I want my dad's sweater vest. So, any questions that I might or might not be able to answer? If not, have a wonderful holiday and Christmas season.